When Brian Wilson died, the world played his music. The headlines praised his genius, but the woman who knew him best, his first wife, didn't say a single word. She didn't attend the funeral. She didn't issue a statement. She vanished. But just days later, something surfaced. A handwritten letter, dated before his death, passed quietly to their daughters, read behind closed doors, and never made public. In a world full of tributes, Marilyn Rovell's silence may have been the loudest of them all. What did she write? Why now, after 45 years of silence? And why did Brian never read it? Tonight, we uncover the story behind the final message that was never meant for the world, but may be the only honest goodbye he ever received.
As tributes poured in from around the world and vintage Beach Boys records spun once more through radios and cafes, one absence raised questions no headline could answer. On June 11, 2025, the music world stood still. Brian Wilson, co-founder of the Beach Boys, the man once called a broken genius, had passed away at the age of 82. News broke through a modest family Instagram post, confirming that the legendary producer had died peacefully at home in California. Almost immediately, a flood of public mourning began. From Paul McCartney to Elton John, from Rolling Stone magazine to NPR, global voices paid tribute to the man who transformed pop harmonies forever. Tributes echoed across every platform, TV, radio, even Times Square. But amid all the voices of praise, one voice remained conspicuously silent. Marilyn Rovell, Wilson's first wife, his muse during Pet Sounds, and the mother of two of his children, was nowhere to be seen. She did not attend the funeral, she issued no statement, and for days there was not a single word from the woman who once stood beside him during his most creatively volatile years. At first, many assumed it was distance, or time, or perhaps old pain. But behind the scenes, something far more private was unfolding. Because while the world grieved out loud, Marilyn Rovell's response came in a form no one expected, and only her family would ever witness. Coming up, a letter sealed in June, a daughter quietly holding it through the funeral, and the words that may have said goodbye long before the world even knew he was gone. In the days following Brian Wilson's funeral, a quiet rumor began to circulate. It wasn't about the music, it wasn't about his legacy. It was about a letter and the woman who may have written it. According to family sources close to the Wilsons, just days before Brian's passing, his former wife, Marilyn Rovell, penned a private handwritten message. The letter, reportedly 2 pages in length, was addressed to her daughters, Carney and Wendy Wilson, and allegedly delivered during the week of the funeral. It wasn't released to the public, no interviews were granted, no scanned image surfaced online. But one family member, speaking on condition of anonymity, confirmed its existence, describing it as Marilyn's only statement in 45 years. The letter, said to be composed on June 5, 2025, arrived less than a week before Brian's death. According to those familiar with its contents, Marilyn didn't seek attention or apology, but rather closure. A small portion of the letter, reportedly read aloud at a private memorial, carried a line that stunned those in attendance. "I loved Brian with all my heart, and I witnessed the disintegration of a person that no one but him could fully understand." The quote has never been officially verified, and no journalist has seen the letter firsthand, but its existence has been acknowledged by multiple individuals within the Wilson family circle, including, reportedly, Carney herself, who kept the note with her throughout the funeral. Perhaps most remarkable was the revelation that Marilyn may have written a second letter, one not to her children, but to Brian himself. That letter, sources say, was left unopened on a table inside Wilson's home, the same table where he once wrote the earliest Beach Boys songs. It was quiet, intentional, a final word not meant for the world, but for the man she once knew, one associate described. To this day, no public statement has come from Marilyn Rovell. The letter remains in private hands, and yet, in a moment of global remembrance, her absence and that letter may have spoken louder than any headline. But before we can understand what that silence meant, we have to return to the beginning, to a California studio, a teenage girl, and a songwriter just beginning to unravel.
Before the breakdowns, before the courtroom battles, before the music reshaped an entire generation, there was a girl group, a teenager, and a chance meeting that would change pop history and leave scars that never fully healed. It was the tail end of 1962. The Beach Boys had just begun to emerge from Southern California garages into national fame. Brian Wilson, then just 20, was already being hailed as a prodigy, a master of harmony, melody, and mood. But away from the microphones, something else was developing. That winter, Brian met Marilyn Rovell, a 15-year-old singer from a trio called the Honeys. She was barely in high school. He was fast becoming the defining musical architect of surf culture. Despite their age gap and the discomfort it caused within both families, especially Brian's father Murray, the two began a relationship. Just 2 years later, in 1964, they were married. Marilyn was 17. The world knew Brian Wilson as a genius in the studio, but behind the scenes, his emotional life was unraveling even as his music soared. That same year, he suffered a massive panic attack aboard a flight to Houston. It was so severe that he quit touring with the Beach Boys permanently, a decision unheard of for a pop star at his peak. While the rest of the band hit the road, Brian retreated to his home and the studio. Marilyn, barely an adult herself, suddenly found herself in the orbit of a man consumed by sonic ambition and inner chaos. He was gentle, sweet, but not really present, she would later say in private to friends. I don't know if he ever lived in the same reality the rest of us did. Within just a few years, that reality would grow more fractured, and Marilyn, still in her teens, would move from newlywed to caretaker. Coming up, the making of Pet Sounds, the crumbling of a marriage, and the songs that masked something much darker than anyone realized at the time. They called it revolutionary, they still do, but behind the iconic sounds of Pet Sounds was a young man slipping further into something no harmony could fix. By 1966, Brian Wilson had stepped away from touring, devoting himself entirely to the studio. The result was Pet Sounds, now regarded as one of the most influential albums in music history. Lush, complex, painfully human. The record was hailed as a creative breakthrough even by rivals like the Beatles. But behind the genius was a man unraveling. In the liner notes and song credits, Marilyn Rovell's name never appears, but those who knew Brian say Pet Sounds was soaked in her presence. Songs like You Still Believe in Me and Caroline No are widely believed to reflect their relationship, full of longing, tension, and emotional fragility. Privately, Brian's behavior was becoming more erratic. He worked obsessively, recording hours upon hours of takes, sometimes layering hundreds of overdubs. At home, he became withdrawn. He rarely ate with his wife. He rarely slept. And when he did speak, it was often in fragments, ideas tangled in visions that didn't always make sense to those around him. Marilyn, still just in her early 20s, had become both muse and emotional caretaker. But even she couldn't keep pace with the demands of Brian's inner world. I used to hope he'd come out of it, but eventually I realized it wasn't something I could save him from. That year, Brian began experimenting with LSD, claiming it expanded his musical imagination. But the visions came with a cost. By the time he started recording Smile, his ambitious follow-up to Pet Sounds, his mental health had deteriorated to the point where sessions often dissolved into chaos. The music was getting bigger, but Brian, he was getting smaller, like he was disappearing into it. The Smile project collapsed in 1967, never finished. For Brian, it was more than just a professional setback. It was a psychological breaking point. And while fans debated what happened to the lost album, Marilyn faced something far more immediate, a partner who was no longer present and a household falling into silence.
As the Beach Boys toured the world, their founder was vanishing inside his own home. And Marilyn Rovell, once a teenage bride, was left to manage not a household, but a crisis that never made the headlines. The collapse of Smile marked more than the end of a musical era. It triggered a deepening spiral of instability for Brian Wilson. By the early 1970s, his life had narrowed to the walls of his bedroom. He no longer performed, he rarely spoke, and he had all but vanished from public view. Inside the Wilson home, Marilyn watched a man she once fell in love with become a stranger. Brian would stay in bed for days, sometimes weeks. He gained weight rapidly,
His diet was erratic. His behavior grew increasingly paranoid and disconnected. Multiple accounts describe him whispering to himself for hours, experiencing vivid hallucinations, and isolating from nearly everyone, even their daughters, Carney and Wendy. The drugs had not opened creative doors, they had shut him off from reality. Marilyn, now in her mid-20s and raising 2 young children, assumed the role of full-time caregiver while also trying to shield her daughters from the emotional weight inside the house. It wasn't that he was cruel, a close family friend once noted. It was that he wasn't there, not really. He was in some other place, and Marilyn was just trying to hold the walls up. To make matters worse, the turmoil wasn't limited to Brian. His father, Murray Wilson, continued to interfere in both his son's career and personal affairs. In one of the most shocking moves, Murray sold the Beach Boys' publishing rights, reportedly without consulting the band. The emotional fallout was devastating, especially for Brian, who viewed the songs as extensions of himself. Caught in the middle, Marilyn found herself alienated not only from Brian, but from the increasingly hostile dynamics surrounding his family and the band. By 1975, she had all but disappeared from public life. And in 1979, after nearly 15 years of marriage, the couple quietly divorced. No public accusations, no lawsuits, just an exhausted separation that mirrored the long silence that had already grown between them. There was no drama, just fatigue, one associate described. They had been over for years before they signed any papers. Following the divorce, Marilyn remained almost entirely out of the spotlight. She never remarried, she focused on raising her daughters, both of whom would go on to find their own voice in music as part of the group Wilson Phillips. But even as Marilyn stepped back, others stepped in, and one of them would take control of Brian's life in a way that would raise alarms across the music industry. By the late 1970s, Brian Wilson was no longer just a withdrawn genius. He was a patient, and the man tasked with healing him would soon seize control of every part of his existence. As Brian Wilson's mental health deteriorated, his family grew desperate. Traditional therapy hadn't helped, the band was still performing, the money was still coming in, but the man behind the music was barely functioning. That's when they turned to Dr. Eugene Landy, a clinical psychologist with a reputation for aggressive intervention. Landy's methods were extreme from the start. He implemented what he called 24-hour therapy, a grueling regime that saw Brian monitored constantly, medicated daily, and placed under near-total supervision. At first, the results appeared promising. Wilson lost weight, he was seen in public again, he even began recording. But it didn't take long for the situation to shift from treatment to control. Landy began isolating Brian from friends and family. Phone calls were monitored, visits were limited. Every aspect of Brian's life, his meals, his finances, even his creative output, was routed through Landy. In contracts obtained years later, Landy's name reportedly appeared not just as Brian's therapist, but as co-producer and co-writer of new music. He wasn't a doctor anymore. He was a gatekeeper, a business partner. And Brian was more of a product than a person. During this period, which lasted more than a decade, from the late 1970s into the early 1990s, Brian Wilson released several solo projects. But fans and critics alike noted a strange shift in tone. Gone was the wild vulnerability of Pet Sounds. In its place were songs shaped by outside hands, overseen by a man whose name had never been part of the Beach Boys' legacy. Family members grew increasingly alarmed. Efforts to contact Brian were often intercepted. Public appearances were heavily scripted, and behind closed doors, those closest to him claimed he was being over-medicated, manipulated, and silenced. It felt like watching someone drown in slow motion, one cousin later said. You could see he wasn't himself, but you didn't know how to reach him. The turning point came in the early 1990s. With pressure mounting and media outlets starting to take notice, a legal case was brought forward. At the center of the fight, a woman Brian had met years earlier, but who refused to stay silent. Coming up, how a former model from a Cadillac showroom mounted the legal battle that would rescue Brian Wilson from the grip of his own therapist and change the course of his final decades.
She wasn't a music executive. She wasn't a therapist. She sold cars in California. But in the darkest chapter of Brian Wilson's life, Melinda Ledbetter became the force that pulled him back from the brink. In 1986, Brian Wilson walked into a Cadillac dealership in Los Angeles. He wasn't looking for a savior, he was just looking for a car. That's where he met Melinda Ledbetter, a former model turned saleswoman. She didn't scream, she didn't gush, she spoke plainly, directly. And for a man who had spent years under the suffocating control of others, her calm confidence was magnetic. They connected immediately. Melinda wasn't impressed by the fame. What she saw was a man who needed help, deep, urgent help. But the problem was, someone else already held the keys to Brian's life, Dr. Eugene Landy. When Landy discovered their growing relationship, he intervened harshly. According to those close to the situation, he threatened to revoke Brian's treatment if he continued seeing Melinda. Brian, still deeply dependent and psychologically fragile, was forced to cut ties. But Melinda didn't walk away. Behind the scenes, she began collecting documents, recordings, and testimony, quietly building a case to expose Landy's overreach on Brian's finances, career, and mind. In 1991, her efforts succeeded. A court issued a permanent restraining order, barring Landy from any further contact with Brian Wilson. Without her, it wouldn't have happened, said one attorney involved in the case. Melinda was the catalyst, she was relentless, and she never made it about her. After the court ruling, Melinda and Brian quietly rekindled their relationship. In 1995, they married. But this was no fairy tale ending. What followed was slow, deliberate reconstruction. Brian had been under someone else's control for over a decade. His self-confidence, his daily routine, even his ability to trust had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Melinda became more than a spouse. She was his manager, publicist, emotional firewall, and often the final decision-maker in matters of Brian's exposure to the outside world. Under her watch, he resumed music, this time on his own terms. He released solo albums, appeared in documentaries, and re-engaged with fans, carefully and with support. Quote, "She gave him boundaries and permission," one collaborator said. He could create, but without the chaos. Together, they adopted 5 children: Dakota, Daria, Delaney, Dylan, and Dash. Their family life was quiet, out of the public eye, and marked by something Brian had never fully known before: stability.
Even legends can forget who they are, and in the final stretch of Brian Wilson's life, the man who once orchestrated soundscapes for a generation slowly drifted into silence, this time not by choice. In early 2024, just months after the public had last seen Brian Wilson, a heartbreaking but long-suspected reality was confirmed. He had been diagnosed with a major neurocognitive disorder, consistent with dementia. The legal filings were brief but clear. Brian, at that point 81 years old, was no longer able to care for himself independently. The documents requested the establishment of a conservatorship. His second wife, Melinda Ledbetter, had passed away just weeks earlier, January 2024, after nearly 30 years of marriage. Her death marked not only the end of a partnership, but the collapse of the structured, protected world she had spent decades building around him. Following her passing, family members stepped in to coordinate Brian's care. The 5 adopted children he shared with Melinda, alongside his biological daughters Carney and Wendy Wilson, came together to form a quiet but united front. While no public interviews were given, those close to the family described a clear shift. The focus moved inward. No tours, no press, just comfort. As Brian's health rapidly declined in the spring of 2025, he was moved into full-time care. He reportedly stopped speaking for long periods, communicated in fragments, and often became disoriented, uncertain of where he was or who he was with. The music was still in his head, said one nurse, but he didn't always know where the notes came from anymore. He passed away peacefully on June 11, 2025, at home in California. There was no drawn-out media rollout, no dramatic announcement, just a single post from the family, confirming that he had gone quietly, surrounded by loved ones. Within hours, the world responded. Radio stations dusted off classic records, tribute playlists trended globally. Headlines called him a genius, an architect of harmony, a tortured visionary. But what most people hadn't seen, what never made it into the headlines, was the quiet family photo released days later. No lighting setup, no labels, just Brian Wilson seated among all 7 of his children, biological and adopted, and several grandchildren. The image, unedited and sincere, showed something the world rarely associated with him: stillness. He wasn't smiling, one relative later remarked, but he looked at peace, and that was something rare for Brian. But amid the tributes, the reposted classics, and the carefully worded obituaries, there remained only one voice missing, a voice from the very beginning. And she would return, not in sound, but in ink. She hadn't appeared in interviews, she hadn't shown up at tributes, she hadn't spoken publicly in over 4 decades. But as Brian Wilson's family gathered to remember him, Marilyn Rovell's voice came through in a way no one expected. According to those closest to the Wilson family, Marilyn Rovell, Brian's first wife and the mother of his 2 daughters, did not attend his funeral. She made no public statement, no photographs surfaced. Her silence was for many just another footnote in a life already defined by distance. But in the circle of family and close friends, something else unfolded. A handwritten letter dated June 5, 2025, just 6 days before Brian's death, was delivered to her daughters, Carney and Wendy Wilson. It had been written in private, without media attention, and was passed along quietly, first to family, then read aloud by Carney during a small private memorial. In it, Marilyn is said to have written plainly, not as a celebrity, not as a widow, but as a woman trying to articulate decades of silence. I loved Brian with all my heart, and I witnessed the disintegration of a person that no one but him could fully understand. Another portion, confirmed by someone present during the reading, referenced the period surrounding the abandoned Smile project, calling Brian a soul who couldn't live in reality. There was no bitterness in her tone, no accusation, only clarity and a kind of grief that had taken a lifetime to mature. Perhaps most haunting was the detail shared quietly by a relative. Marilyn had also written a second letter, this one to Brian. She wrote it before the official news of his death, possibly sensing the end was near. That letter never reached him while he was alive. Instead, it was placed on a small table inside his home, the very table where he had once written his earliest songs for the Beach Boys. It was a gesture, the source said, not meant for the world, just for him. One last presence in the room before he left it. For over 40 years, Marilyn Rovell had remained entirely silent. No memoirs, no documentaries, no red carpet reconciliations. Her total absence from Brian's later life became part of the mythology surrounding him. And yet in the final moment, her voice returned, not in a headline, not in a soundbite, but in handwriting, meant only for family. And in that letter, passed quietly among daughters, placed quietly on a table, one of music's longest and quietest goodbyes finally reached its end.
When the world said goodbye to Brian Wilson, it played his greatest hits. But the true farewell, the one without music, without press, without applause, came from the woman whose voice had been missing for decades. Marilyn Rovell didn't stand at a podium. She didn't post a photo or issue a statement. She wrote a letter, a personal, unpublicized, handwritten goodbye. And for those who heard it, it wasn't bitter. It wasn't glamorous. It was something much harder to find in this world. Honest. She spoke of a man she once loved deeply, a man she watched disintegrate under pressure, fame, and illness. A man she couldn't save, no matter how close she stood. Brian Wilson will always be remembered for his genius, for the harmonies, the innovation, the falsetto refrains that seemed to hover above the California surf. But for those who lived with him, behind the music, behind the fame, the story was never quite so beautiful. It was hard. And often, it was quiet. He was a legend, yes, but he was also a deeply fragile man, torn between melody and madness, surrounded by people who either saved him or used him. And in the very end, it was the 2 women who had loved him most, Marilyn and Melinda, who helped define the closing chapters of his life. One through decades of caregiving, the other through a letter read only in whispers. The real story of Brian Wilson, one friend said, isn't just in the music he made. It's in the silence that followed. And maybe that's the truth behind every genius we idolize. The work is eternal, but the person is complicated, messy, and often unseen. So if this story moved you,
If you've ever heard God Only Knows and wondered what kind of soul could write something that tender, now you know. The answer isn't simple. It never was. This was the final note Brian Wilson never sang, but one that deserves to be heard. If you found something meaningful in this story, share it. Subscribe for more true-life narratives about the people behind the music. And in the comments, tell us, what song of Brian Wilson's meant something to you? What do you remember now that you've heard the story behind the sound? Thank you for watching.